Hello everyone, greetings and welcome to our Year 13 level chemistry. This is your chemistry teacher Mrs. Kumar, and with me I want to welcome everyone on board so that we can venture out on this year's chemistry. So to start off with, we are going to be looking at strand 1.1 where we are going to be learning about some scientific skills. Now in this particular session, I will be taking you through on how to investigate the skills and techniques which are required in experimental work. At the same time, we will learn how to represent the data in a meaningful and useful way. We will also learn how to organize and process the data to identify certain trend, patterns, and relationships. So with that in mind, let's dive into our first lesson for the year. To start off with, let's look at what graphs are. Now we are going to be looking at the different types of graphs and study the different relationship that will be portrayed by each kind of graph. Graphs in mathematics will be defined as a pictorial representation or a diagram which represents the data in an organized manner. In short, we can say it is a way to represent numerical data. Moreover, graphs make our work easier because we can read, compare, and identify certain trend from it. At the same time, we can use a graph to make certain predictions. So there are several types of graphs which can be used to determine the different kind of information. But in chemistry, we are mostly relying on line graphs. In a line graph, there are two very important components, an x-axis and a y-axis. The horizontal axis will always be the independent variable, okay, which is our x-axis, while the vertical axis, that's our y-axis, will always have our dependent variable. So what is a dependent and independent variable? Now, independent simply means that it doesn't require the input of the other variable in order for it to progress. Dependent variable, however, depends on the independent variable. Like for instance, time doesn't depend on any other variable. Time is independent. It goes on its own. However, temperature is dependent on the time. Temperature can vary according to the different times. So temperature can go on the y-axis while time can go on the x-axis. Let's look at some of the examples of dependent and independent variables. First of all, variables are anything that can be changed in an experiment. So whenever we are filling a data in a result table, it is very important to understand that the independent data goes in the first column while the dependent data goes in the second column. So if you look at this particular graph here, you can see there's a graph which is comparing temperature and volume. Temperature is going to affect the volume. So when temperature affects the volume, temperature becomes the independent variable, while volume depends on the temperature. So it becomes the dependent variable. That is why it goes on the y-axis. Let's look at example number 1. There's an experiment, okay, which shows the effect of altering temperature of a gas on the volume. So there's a temperature and a volume study taking place here. Which variable is going to affect which one? Volume doesn't affect temperature. Temperature affects the volume. Therefore, the independent variable here is temperature, because the higher the temperature is, the greater the volume will be. And the dependent variable in this case will be the volume. Example 2. There is an experiment which is used to determine the effect of temperature on the rate of a reaction. So what is dependent on what? The rate of a reaction depends on the temperature. Temperature doesn't depend on the rate of a reaction. Temperature is independent. So temperature is the independent variable, while the rate of a reaction will be the dependent variable. So when we plot the graph of these two examples, we will have the temperature going on the x-axis and the volume or the rate of a reaction going on the y-axis. Example number 3. There is an experimenter which studies the impact of drug on cancer-causing cells. So what is going to affect the results here? Is the cancer-causing cells going to affect the impact of the drug, or the drug is going to affect the cancer-causing cells? The drug is going to alter the cancer-causing cells. Therefore, independent variable is the amount or the dosage of the drug, how much drug is administered, okay, to the cells, while the dependent variable is the impact of the drug on the cancer causing cells. What is the effect of the drug when it is administered on the cells? So I hope you have understood the difference between a dependent and the independent variable by now. Given the question, you should be able to identify from the experiment which one is which. So keeping in mind, when we are doing this exercise, you must always remember to put the independent on the x-axis and dependent on the y, and also keeping in mind when we are filling the data table, the independent goes on in the first column while the dependent goes in the second column. Graphs can show different types of relationship. So here we can see two types of relationship that is shown by two types of graphs. So let's look at the first type of graph. This particular graph, which is showing a direct relationship. A direct relationship is also known as a positive linear relationship, as we can see in this particular graph here. So we say that in this case, the temperature and the volume, they are directly related to one another. What it basically increases, the volume will increase. Let's just say, for instance, okay, we have some values here. So this is a value on the temperature range. So if, let's say, the value of the temperature is this one, okay, let's say this is 2. So if the volume is 2, temperature is 2 degrees, or it can be any value, just making it up here. The volume is going to be probably, let's say, 5. Okay, all right, let's just make this 20 degrees here, just to make it a little bit more realistic. And then if the temperature increases up to, let's say, 30 degrees Celsius or maybe 35, what is going to happen to the volume on the other side? As you can see, according to the graph, as the temperature soars up to 35 degrees Celsius, so does the volume. So let's say the volume here becomes 10. So as the temperature is increasing, the volume is also increasing. That is showing a direct relationship. On the other hand, this particular graph here, this graph shows an inverse relationship or a negative linear relationship. An inverse relationship is where one variable will increase and the other. Example here. Let's say one more time, if the temperature here is 20 degrees Celsius. If the temperature is 20 degrees Celsius, then what is the density reading going to be? So we take the ruler up, okay, up to the mark and read it across. So you can see there is a high reading here, okay. But if the temperature is higher, let's say it goes all the way up here, increases to 50 degrees Celsius, then the reading goes up, and as we can see that the density has shown a lower reading. So that as the temperature is increasing, the density is decreasing. Okay. Graphs can be used to make certain predictions or estimations. In a graph, we can predict certain points. Let's say, for example, if there are two measured points and we have to make a prediction between them, that prediction is called interpolation. And the point is known as interpolation. Graph on the right hand side. So in this particular graph, there is a plotted point A up till point B. This is how long the graph is in the axis. Now, if I want to know what is the predicted point A here at point C, I want to know what is the data reading. So all I will be doing is to make a prediction between two measured points. So to do that, that is called interpolation. When I want to make a prediction beyond the measured points, that is called extrapolation. So for example, the graph is up till measured point B, but if I want to know what is the reading up till here, then an imaginary line is going to be drawn, and that line is going to help us to make the prediction. So we are making this prediction beyond the plotted graph, which is called extrapolation. So either you do it before the graph here, or after the graph. If you are making a prediction beyond the plot, then that is called extrapolated point. Let's look at this example on the left hand side. This graph is going from this point here all the way up till here. Okay, so if I want to know what is the temperature at 11 seconds, now you can see in the graph, this graph is actually ending at 10 seconds. So up till 10 seconds, I will be able to take the reading. All I have to do is to take a ruler and just read it across. But if I want to know what is the temperature reading at 11 seconds, so what I will be doing is to join a line using a ruler so that I will be able to make accurate predictions, and then find out where the 11 second is and make a mark. Take a reading across, and we will see that the estimated temperature will be 150 degrees Celsius. This is an estimation made beyond the point. So that is the extrapolated point. If I want to make a prediction here between two measured points, so within the graph, there are a lot of measured points. I want to make a prediction within the graph. So to do that, I am going to just take the ruler, draw it across, and then I will be able to take the reading and make the estimation. So this is known as the interpolated graph. So two things to remember when you are using a graph, when you're making estimation, you will be able to make an extrapolated estimation or a interpolated estimation. When working in the laboratory, there are certain principles or protocols that we have to follow. One of the most important things we have to keep in mind is to maintain safety in the lab. The science lab is an inherently dangerous place where we have fire hazards, dangerous chemical, and even risky procedures, which is why no one wants to have accident in the lab. So it is very important to follow the lab safety rules. The first important lab safety rule that we have to keep in mind is to know where the safety equipments are located. And then we can learn how to use the safety equipment. In an event of an accident involving eyes, let's say the eyes have come in contact with a certain chemical. What is the first aid we have to do? So the first thing we have to do is to run to the nearest eye wash fountain, if there is one. An eye wash fountain is used to flush away the chemical which enter the eyes, and they are either splashed on the face as well or covering the eyes. It is very important that we learn how to use an eye wash fountain. First step, remove the cap on the mouth of the sprayer. So the picture of an eye wash fountain here. So this is the cap that has to be removed in order for the water to be spraying out. Step number 2, place your eyes directly over the water sprayer and firmly push on the lever. So this is how your eyes should be open, where the water is spraying up, and all the time this is the lever that has to be pushed on. This treatment has to be repeated continuously for at least 15 minutes, even if you feel that the irritation has subsided. So it is very important, students, that we know exactly where in our laboratory this is located. In some laboratories, or in most of the laboratories rather, this eye wash fountain may not be available. So it is very important that in case of any incident, you must wash your eyes with plenty running water, cold water, for a minimum of 15 minutes. Okay, so that is an alternative to the eye wash fountain method. Secondly, in case if there is an incident which involves the splashing of the chemical on your body, then we have to run to the nearest safety shower. Our safety shower is going to flush away any chemical which may be spilled on our body. So the first thing we have to do is to stand directly under the shower. At this point, modesty is not going to play an important role. We have to keep in safety in mind. Pull the lever down immediately to flush the affected area with plenty water for minimum of 15 minutes. and we have to protect the eyes from any further damage. And number 3, remove any contaminated clothing, jewelry, or even shoes when you are standing under the safety shower. Let's look at some of the hazardous symbols which are used in any workplace or any laboratories. So we are going to be studying about some of the new hazardous symbols which are currently in practice. Hazardous symbols usually come in the form of pictograms, which are graphic images. These pictograms often carry a distinctive red square on any of the points so that it is clearly visible. And inside the border is a symbol which represents a potential hazard, like it can be a fire hazard, a health hazard, a corrosive, etc. Together, the symbol and the border are referred to as the pictogram. Each pictogram is assigned to a specific hazard, which it categorizes. So as we can see in this table here, we have a few examples of a few hazardous signs. So the first one, known as explosives. Explosives are labeled for those kind of substances which are made for explosion or reactivity hazards. Okay. Then we have a fire-like symbol here. So this fire-like symbol represents fire or flammable liquids, those liquids which can easily catch fire. And then we have oxidizing liquids. Some of these oxidizing liquids, they have a high compatibility with flammable substances. So it is very important to keep these two away from each other. Now, oxidizing symbols, these are the ones which will cause a chemical to undergo oxidation, and they are known as oxidizing hazards. And then we have this particular symbol here. This particular symbol is usually represented for gas cylinders, for any gases that are packed under pressure. Corrosive to metals. Corrosion or corrosive to metals are for those corrosive substances which damage the metals as well as the skin or the eyes. Acute toxicity. You can see that there is a skull and crossbone. Now, this symbol symbolizes that it can cause death with toxicity with even short-term exposure of small amounts. So, it is a very easy way to remember that acute toxicity can be represented in a form of death. Then we have skin corrosion. Skin corrosion, again, it is for corrosive substances which are corrosive in nature to the skin. And then we can see an exclamation mark symbol here. This exclamation mark symbol may cause less serious health issues, but it can affect the environment as well as the skin. So it is known as a skin irritation. But in comparison to the other hazard symbols, this can be a little milder. Over here, we can see there is an aspiration hazard. This aspiration hazard or health hazard may cause or suspecting of causing serious health effect. And then we can see that there is a fish in the picture with a tree in the background. Okay, so that represents environment. This kind of symbol, it signifies environmental hazard. So it can cause damage to the aquatic environment as well as the aquatic surrounding areas as well. Now I will just familiarize you with some of the old hazardous symbols, as you can see here. So in comparison to the new hazardous symbols, you can see the old hazardous symbols, they are not having the red border around them. And this is the reason why these old ones are obsolete now. However, they are very much similar in their graphical image to the new ones that we are currently using. So you just have to familiarize yourself with the different hazardous symbols, the new ones compared to the old ones, because you may be asked in the exam to recall these symbols. Occupational health and safety is very important in any workplace, which is why in this particular part of the video, we are going to be looking at some of the safety measures of hazardous substances. Let's have a look at how we are going to handle different hazardous symbols in the lab or in any workplace, and having a look at some of the examples of these hazardous substances. The first type of hazardous substances we will be looking at are known as flammable chemicals. Flammable and combustible liquids are liquids which can burn. These are classified as either flammable or combustible depending on their flash points. So when we are talking about flammable liquid, we are talking about those liquids which can catch fire easily at normal working temperatures or at room temperatures, while combustible liquids are those liquids which can burn at slightly higher temperatures than normal room temperature. Each liquid has a different flash point, and these flash points will tell us at what temperature the liquids are going to be safe, or the liquids can catch fire. Now, the lowest temperature at which the liquid can give off enough vapor to be ignited is known as a flash point, and in order to prevent this liquid from burning or setting the lab on fire, it is important not to place them near open flame or any spark producing equipment. Make sure all the sources of ignition are removed, like spark, smoke, flame, hot surfaces, whenever we are dealing with these two types of chemicals. Always use small amount of flammable chemicals, because if used in larger quantities, it can lead to a fire which can be hard to control. Keep the storage area cool and dry at all the time. Store all the flammable and combustible liquid away from any compatible materials. So for example, if we're looking at flammable substances, they are highly compatible with the oxidizers. So whenever flammable chemical and an oxidizing agent come in contact with each other, the heat that is given out is highly exothermic, which can cause a lot of hazardous in the environment as well as to the person who may be doing the experiment. Store all the flammable and combustible liquid in a well ventilated area, and keep the container closed at all the time except when in use. Some of the examples of flammable chemicals are alcohols like ethanol, acetone, which is a ketone, benzene, cyclohexane, dimethyl ether or any kind of ether. So these chemicals are just some examples of flammable chemicals. We should have the following procedures in order. The next category of hazardous substances are known as corrosive substances. Corrosive chemicals are those which are highly reactive and can destroy and damage materials such as living tissues, metals, or even wood. It may be possible to substitute this corrosive chemical for even less hazardous alternatives. However, if you cannot find an alternative, then we have to take certain precautions whenever we are storing, handling, or even using them. Some of the chemical safety rules that we have to keep in mind are storing them in a well-labeled container away from incompatible material in a cool and dry area. Use these chemicals in a well-ventilated area, and always ensure you are using gloves, aprons, and safety specs to prevent these chemicals from getting in contact with your skin or even your eyes. Make sure you check for any leakage or any swelling in the container before you use them, because any of such things is present there, it can indicate that the chemical is not pure. It may have deteriorated in its nature, or it is not safe to handle it. Handle the container in such a way to avoid damaging it. And once you are done using the chemical, be sure to dispense all the chemicals carefully and keep the containers closed at all the time when you are not using them. Now, when you are diluting these corrosive substances, it is important to follow this particular information. So this instruction is for those chemicals which are corrosive in nature and you are diluting them. Always add the chemical in cold water with slow stirring. Do not add the water into the corrosive chemical. Otherwise, it will trigger a highly exothermic reaction. Some of the examples of corrosive substances that we are familiar with are examples of acids such as hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, nitric acid, organic acid like acetic acids. Some of the bases which are also corrosive in nature are ammonium hydroxide, potassium hydroxide, sodium hydroxide, and many more. Sometimes some of the chemicals that we use in the laboratories or even at workplaces are toxic in nature. These chemicals are hazardous to the health and can cause illness and even injury if they are not handled properly. So it is very important that before the employees start using these chemicals, they are familiar with its potential hazard and how to protect themselves and be aware of the procedure to follow if an accident takes place. Some of the safety things we have to keep in mind when dealing with these chemicals are to store and handle them in a well-ventilated area. So we have seen that for flammable, corrosive, and even toxic chemical, they have to be stored in well-ventilated area away from incompatible materials. Always wear personal protective equipment, which is PPE for short, like safety pack, aprons, and even gloves. Keep the container closed whenever you are not using them, and always use a small amount of the chemical in the workplace. Do not return any unused chemical back to the stock container. Otherwise, it will end up contaminating the samples. So, some of the things we have to always keep in mind whenever we have toxic chemicals around us is to handle and dispose these toxic chemicals in a safe manner. Some of the examples of the toxic chemicals are hydrogen cyanide, hydrogen sulfide, mercury, lead, formaldehyde, chloroform, methanol, acetonitrile. Explosive chemicals are another very high risk area where we are dealing with those kind of substances which can decompose or even burn rapidly whenever there is a sudden shock or ignition around them. Explosive chemicals produce a large amount of heat and gas when they are triggered, and therefore they are extremely dangerous in nature. Keep these chemicals out of sunlight and any heat sources. And make sure you are familiar with the chemical before you actually use them. Prevent any shock or ignition in progress. Now, in 2020, on August 4th, there was a massive chemical detonation which occurred in the port of Beirut, which is in Lebanon. There was ammonium nitrate, which was kept in one of the warehouses. Ammonium nitrate is one of the explosive chemicals, which even in a small amount of shock can trigger its explosive nature. Nitrogen trichloride and silver nitride. So these are some of the highly potent explosive chemicals. Silver nitride is one of the dangerous chemicals which can form as a byproduct in the making of silver mirror. So in the making of silver mirror, it is very important that you keep on stirring the mixture. Otherwise, it can end up in the formation of a chemical called silver nitride. Chemicals are another category of hazardous chemicals. These chemicals are those which can cause oxidation but itself will get reduced. So it is important that we keep these materials in a well-labeled container in a cool and dry place. Avoid any heat source such as spark, smoke, flame, or even hot surface whenever we are using the oxidizing chemical. Handle them in such a manner and keep them in a well-ventilated area away from flammable substances. Handle the container safely to avoid damaging them. And once we are done with the chemical, we must carefully dispense them and keep the container and the equipment in a safe place. Keep the container closed at all the time when we are not using them. And only use a small amount whenever possible. Do not return any contaminated material back to the stock bottle. Some of the examples of oxidizing chemicals are like bromine, any kind of peroxides like hydrogen peroxide, permanganate like potassium permanganate, nitrates, all the nitrates they are classified as oxidizing chemicals, chromates and dichromates. After we learn how to keep the different hazardous materials in check, we must also know how to dispose the chemicals in a proper way. So let's see how the different chemicals can be disposed in different manners. There are certain chemicals which can be poured into the sink, and these chemicals include chemicals like acids or alkalis. But before we pour them down in the sink, we must always neutralize them first. Neutralizing simply involves a process where the unused acid will react with a base to produce salt in water and vice versa. So some of the examples of the chemicals which can go in the sink are inorganic chemicals like salts and the acids and the bases which are diluted in nature. Alcohols which contain the salt can also be dissolved and poured into the sink. Then we have some chemicals which can be stored in waste bottles. These chemicals should not be poured into the sink. Once we store the chemicals in a waste bottle, we can do fractional distillation and recover the chemical one more time. Some of the examples include organic solvents. So whenever we do experiments and we have some leftover organic chemicals, we must keep them in waste bottles so that afterwards fractional distillation can be run and we can get the chemical back from its impurities. Paraffins and mineral oils are other examples of those chemicals which can be kept in the waste bottle. Control waste. These are examples such as sharp objects of metal or fine powders or any dirty sample of tubes or any lightly contaminated chemicals. So these materials should be all disposed in a controlled manner to be kept in a proper labeled bin. And then we have those chemicals which require special disposal method, like those which are poisonous in nature or they are highly toxic in nature. So we do this kind of disposal for chemicals which involve specially mercury or any carcinogenic substances. Carcinogenic chemicals are those which can cause cancer. There are some materials which can directly be dumped into the rubbish bin. Like these include paper, plastic materials, and any other miscellaneous materials. However, it is important that the laboratory bins are properly labeled. Whenever experiments are done, it is important to know and familiarize yourself with the different chemicals that is being used. In order to do that, there is a usage of a safety data sheet. A safety data sheet is a document which is providing important information on the properties of the hazardous chemical and how they can affect the health, and at the same time how to deal with it if there is an incident involving them. So you can see that on the right hand side there is an example of a safety data sheet. This safety data sheet should be available at any workplace, and this actually tells us the identity of the chemical. It also gives the different chemical names like synonyms of this particular chemical, the supplier's detail, and you can see that there are hazard identification symbols given as well. So in this example here, the example is that of hydrogen sulfide. So you can see that it is falling under the category of flammable, gas under pressure, acute toxicity, specific toxicity or irritant, and even aquatic hazard. So these are some of the hazards that this particular chemical can pose. And in order for this chemical to be used in the laboratory, there are other safety precautions that has to be read in this safety data sheet. So the other part of this safety data sheet will include the safety procedure in case there is an incident involving hydrogen sulfide. So let's see what are some of the important things that are found in a safety data sheet. Our safety data sheet should include information such as the identity of the chemical, which will be the symbol, the formula of the chemical, and some of the synonyms. The property of the chemical, the physical, health, and environmental hazard signs, protective, safe handling and storage procedure, disposal consideration, how the chemical can be disposed, safety precaution for handling, storing, and transporting the chemical, and any other important information regarding the particular chemical. Whenever experiments are done in the lab, there are certain techniques that we need to familiarize ourselves with. Such techniques are those which can allow us to either purify the substance or to make the separation of the liquid and the gas solid phase easier. Refluxing is one of the techniques that is used quite often in those processes which involves organic chemicals. Now, in this particular process, you can see how the assembly of the glassware is actually done. It is where the vapor will cool back into the flask. Now, this particular process is used for those chemicals which are hard to dissolve. So, any chemical which cannot dissolve in a normal heating method can be put into a refluxing setup. The entire mixture is heated up in a water bath, and then the chemical changed into a vapor where the vapor changes into a liquid. So this liquid will drop back into the reaction vessel where the continuous cycle of evaporation and condensation takes place. And in this case, we ensure that the reactants are completely used up. So in a refluxing setup, the round bottom flask is directly connected to the condenser. Distillation is another technique which is quite often used in laboratories, which is used to separate um, solids which are soluble in a liquid. Or a fractional distillation is also another type of distillation which is used to separate soluble liquids from each other or miscible liquids from each other. So in this case, we have a distillation setup where the round bottom flask is connected to a, you can see there is an adapter here, and this adapter is connected to a condenser. The purpose of the condenser is to make sure it keeps the liquids, the particles cool at all the time, and it changes the vapor into a liquid. That liquid can be collected in a collection flask here. So the liquid will be known as a distillate. So in a distillation setup, in comparison to a refluxing setup, the vapor is collected in a separate flask. Here, individual components of the mixture are separated out, and each liquid has a different boiling point, and this is the case for a fractional distillation. The round bottom flask is connected to a Y adapter. Instead of directly connected in a refluxing setup, it is connected in a Y adapter, which is then connected to a condenser. So you need to know the differences between a refluxing setup and a distillation setup. A refluxing setup is actually used to prevent the loss of volatile substances, while a distillation setup is used to separate the individual component of a soluble mixture. The third important experimental technique that we have to understand is on determination of the melting point of a substance. Melting point is the temperature at which the solid changes into a liquid. This is the experiment that is used to determine the melting point of a substance. Now, the reason why a melting point is important is because it will determine the purity of a substance. If a small amount of impurity is present, the melting point of the substance will be lower. So whenever we do experiments, whether it is experiments of recrystallization, experiments involving synthesizing, or even to make any kind of organic chemical, we need to compare the melting point of the substance against the theoretical melting point. So students, this brings us to the end of the first session of our topic on strain 1.1. With that, I'm bidding you farewell and hoping to meet in the next session very soon. Until then, take care. Bye.